Okay, welcome to this session dealing with critical raw materials and circular economy. My name is Ignacio Calleja. I am senior advisor at EIT Raw Materials, and I'm going to try to do my best moderating this interesting session. Just to start, I would like to introduce the moderation team. There we have Andrea with us. Andrea is going to deal with questions from our colleagues online participating in the session. So any questions from people participating online, please send it through the app, and Andrea will moderate these questions from our side. And then we have Maria. Maria will be our reporter. And we have four wonderful panelists together with us. We have Konstantin from the ERC. We have Emmanuel from EURIC, the European Union Recyclers Industries Confederation. I think I see it right? Perfect. Then we have Chris from Eurometaux, and we have Antoine from the Institute for European Environmental Studies. So, as you can see in the agenda, we didn't go for so many presentations. Okay. Our idea today is to have only 3 small presentations and then to have time for discussions, because we think that it could be much more interesting for all of us, much more useful for all of us to have more time for discussions and questions. Okay? So just to introduce, I think that if you allow me, I would like to say that it seems that just now in Europe we are in a transition time in almost everything. We have the green transition, we have the digital transition, we have the energy transition, we have the industrial transition, but I think that there is a common issue between all these transition processes, which is the necessity of critical raw materials, the necessity of critical raw materials to achieve the objectives of all these transition processes. So it's absolutely critical for Europe to secure the supply of these critical raw materials. And even more, I would say that it's absolutely critical to achieve a sustainable supply of critical raw materials. So I would like to first invite Konstantin from the ERC to give us the 10 minutes presentation. Thank you, Konstantin.
Thank you, and hello to everybody. I know that there's a very difficult task for me, because I'm here as, I'm not necessarily perceived as a JRC person. I'm perceived as a representative of the Commission, which is somehow normal. And I know the expectations that you may have from me, because we are talking about the CRM Act, not only about the circular economy. However, I will talk today more about the circular economy, and I will let you still think of the future when it will be about the CRM Act. No, I'm joking. I will touch a little bit the topic of the CRM Act, because this is the subject of our today's session. What I want to say from the perspective of the Commission, and also after that from the perspective of the Joint Research Center of the Commission, that actually you know that we are supporting with science-based evidence the making of EU policies. I think the 2 key words of today are actually the words that put together the whole story. When critical raw materials were first mentioned in a document that have binding things in it, was in relation to the circular economy action plan, the first action plan in 2015. Before that, there were mentions of critical raw materials in the initiative, but without having clear legal aspects behind. And for many years, even after the Circular Economy Action Plan appeared, CRM were present mainly in the apparition every 3 years of the list of critical raw materials, which we very well know that still has no clear binding effect, yeah, and probably is good on one hand to be like that. The issue is that since the first critical circular economy action plan, at least appeared the necessity of talking about the need of monitoring critical raw materials, the need of monitoring raw materials, non-fuel, non-food, because this is what we are talking today about, and this is what CRMs are about. Although, if I'm thinking of what Ignacio said in the beginning, yeah, the raw materials are at the core of our existence and of our interest. But let's put also fuels and food together with the rest of raw materials, and then we have the full picture. Yeah, I mean, what would we be without the raw materials? And that's a very important issue. Now, let's not talk about so much about the past. Let's talk about our interest now. Still, I have to say, since 2015, what we noticed as supporters of EU policies from inside the Commission, what we noticed is the raise of the awareness on this topic. And I think this is my main message for today. This is the most important thing that happened in the last almost decade. The raise of the awareness, then the unification, the getting together of the stakeholders around this topic. And this is, again, very important. And here I have to say the Commission had a very important role. I have to give the king's benefit to DG Grow, to our colleagues in DG Grow, because they were pushing very much, but it's the Commission that brought this together. And if we think of the push for the formation of the alliance on raw materials, the formation of all the very, very important organizations, including EIT raw materials, yeah, during this period, that are dealing with the topic. And now the topic is really on everybody's lips, yeah. Everybody is waiting in March to see the new CRM Act, announced by the President of the Commission in the second part of last year, yeah. A little bit to some people's surprise, and because of the surprise, I can say it was a rushing process to start working and designing the future CRM Act, and hopefully we will see something very relevant that will also have clear actions and legislative proposals attached to it very soon. On the other hand, what I have to say about the Commission's efforts is that the CRM, so the critical raw materials, are and should not be and will not be probably looked at only as critical raw materials anymore. We are talking here about raw materials, again, non-food, non-fuel, raw materials that are extremely important in strategic value chains, in strategic sectors for the European society, economy, and so on. And I think this will be one of the powerful things of the CRM Act, that will come with a definition of what is really strategic and what is important for Europe when talking about raw materials. The second aspect is that this Commission has brought several priorities, and the CRMs are practically horizontal to many of these priorities. But I have to say, people are talking mostly about three of them, and these are, of course, the Green Deal, the European Union Green Deal, the digital Europe, and the stronger Europe in the world. And if you think, the main issues and challenges posed by the interest we have for raw materials are looking at the dimension of security of supply, are looking at the dimension of economic importance, are looking at the dimension of our own consumption and needs, and they are indeed embedded in these three priorities, because the EU Green Deal is the main priority dealing with the circular economy concept. The digital Europe digital economy is the main priority dealing with industrial policy and economic sectors and industrial ecosystems in Europe, whereas the stronger Europe in the world is clearly the priority embedding very important the international relations of Europe and the trade policy of Europe. And we cannot talk about raw materials and supply without talking about our trade policy when it comes to EU versus the rest of the world. So these are the three main priorities under which the CRM Act will clearly come with its actions proposed. I don't expect to see too many actions. This is one advice I'm trying to give. Without knowing the truth, yeah, I don't know yet exactly the final form of it, but don't expect too many actions, and there is a reason for this. The Commission and Europe cannot come with anything that touches legislation at Europe higher level without taking into account the need of consistency with everything else that is already in place. Yeah? So we have to think of everything that is already there in terms of production, of sustainable consumption, in terms of environmental legislation, in terms of trade policy, in terms of social policies, and so on. Yeah? We have to think of what already has been done with the waste framework regulation. We have, or will be done. We have to think what happened with the former sustainable production and consumption policy and the product policies, also with the chemical policies. We have to think to be consistent with all these already binding documents for the Commission. And not the last thing I have to mention, when we talk about raw materials, it's like talking about Europe's agricultural policy, yeah, the common agricultural policy. We are not only touching ground, so the land resources. And yes, I am the head of the unit dealing in JRC with land resources and sustainable supply chains. But we are talking about land use, and we are talking about the interest of all member states on having autonomy still on the policies affecting their land. So it's not easy to think that all the member states will not have and will not want to have a say on any legislative proposal or binding thing that comes at higher level. So it will be a process of negotiation. Yeah. One last thing before I finish, or I think I passed the 10 minutes. One last thing is the importance of events. Maybe now is time for Europe to act. After being a little bit too reactive in the last years. I mean, if I'm thinking, in 2018, it was Trump, I think, still in lead of US, yeah? And he came with very, very unpleasant measures taken on trade barriers on steel and aluminum intermediate products. Europe reacted, but reacted with a little bit of delay, yeah? But that was a first sign. Then it came the issue of China's, let's say, almost monopolistic position in the supply of many of these so-called critical raw materials. And Europe noticed, of course, but still it took some time, and it will always take some time to react fully. Then it came the COVID. COVID hit the whole society, changed the way in which we are thinking now, and it took also some time to react to that. And finally, I don't want to say it was the Ukraine invasion by Russia, which maybe made us really coming to awakening, yeah. And this is why probably the president of the Commission came with the announcement of the CRM Act in the end of 2022. One last thing now, because I'm from JRC, and the JRC has to support all the services of the Commission. We are bound to continue our work on two main aspects. First aspect is to really support all the services that will be interested in all the policies that will be proposed for implementation in the future by the CRM Act and the package that will be attached to it. And this means that we will investigate further for consistency, and we will provide, let's say, bridging elements and gap analysis to match various policies between them. And second, we will continue what we started already since 2014, that is monitoring the knowledge, at least related to the EU policies on non-food, non-fuel raw materials with this European Commission's raw material information system, because we know that we are on the good track. Last year, when based on the knowledge that we had already after the start of the conflict in Ukraine, we came with some short briefings or country-specific fishes dedicated to this event, yeah, or we noticed a massive interest of our stakeholders and a growth of visitors for this knowledge management tool, which practically told us that even if we may not have the freshest data available, the fact that we were able to gather the information in one, let's say, source is a positive thing which has to be continued. And I will say that we will be, from the perspective of the Commission, we will be part of any larger construction that may result for monitoring this activity, because having all the data, all the knowledge, all the information together helps us in taking the everyday decision. So practically this is my last comment.
Thank you, Konstantin. I'm sure that we will have many questions from our participants here and online later during the discussion process. So we move now to Emmanuel, and you have 5 minutes for your presentation.
I know, try to be timely. I think, so my name is Emmanuel Katrakis. I'm the Secretary General of EURIC, the European Recycling Industry Confederation. I'm also a member of the coordination group of the European Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform. I'd like to thank everyone today for being here. I'd like to thank my fellow coordinators and the co-chair, Frick, for the amazing work you've been doing for now more than a year. Obviously speak a bit about critical raw materials. I think if I try to take 4 or 5 points, the first one is the fact that the Critical Raw Materials Act, that is going to be normally published in a couple of days, is basically combining two aspects: sustainable development and green industry. And I think it's absolutely essential, if we want to transition, to make sure that we have a strong industrial basis in Europe, from basically raw materials to the production of end products, that strives and that is able to cope with basically all the targets that we have in the Green Deal, in the New Circular Economy Action Plan, and do so in a way which is resource efficient and climate efficient. And so obviously having a CRM Act that goes that goes very much beyond awareness raising, because as you've mentioned, the list of CRM is there for quite some years. I think the first one was in 2007, something like that, to concrete actions to be able to be a bit less dependent on CRMs is absolutely essential. One of the challenges that obviously the Commission has to cope with, and that recyclers also have to cope with, is the fact that you have a very large diversity of CRMs in the list. And so the market failures that you have to cope with are entirely different, whether you speak about rare earth elements that are massively used in electronics, or whether you speak about phosphorus that you can recover from wastewater, or whether you speak about rubber that you find in tires. The issues surrounding, and what makes them more critical are usually different. You have a great diversity. CRMs, and I think it's worth mentioning, it are not per se scarce always. Actually, they are sometimes very much it's a matter of mineral exploitation and uneven distribution across the globe of CRMs, and that makes Europe a bit more subject to disruption risks. So now, when it comes to recycling and the contribution of recycling to basically de-risking supply of CRMs, recycling won't be able, obviously, to completely substitute mining. That goes without saying, and I think especially today that's something that can be mentioned openly, but recycling can obviously play a much larger share in de-risking supply chain, and by basically being in a position to recycle more CRMs that are being found in end products. To do that, and again it's a very generic key messages that I'm going to deliver, we need a few ingredients. I'm going to start, for instance, with e-waste. In electronics you find CRMs. we do have a number of barriers. The first barrier is proper collection, and this is why I think and there should be links that are being made between, on one hand, the CRM Act and legislation that already exists. If we look at the collection targets of e-waste in legislation, they are set at 65%, and if we look today at the collection rate across Europe, the one that is an average of the different collection rates, we are at less than 50%. And I'm not even going to speak at the methodology and how those numbers are being reported. That could be drastically improved. But one of the facts is the fact that indeed we are not so, we still have a lot of room to improve, obviously, collection. Point number two is basically the ability to recover those CRMs. And again, when we look at the diversity of CRMs, one thing that will play a role, but again at product category levels, is design for remanufacturing, designed for recycling. That will be absolutely essential. And here again, it's extremely difficult to give a kind of a silver bullet, because the way you are going to have proper design for recycling criteria have to be set at product category level. We need to do that at a consistent basis. I can take very different types of examples, but if you want to be able to recover CRM that you are going to use in flat panel displays, for instance, you need obviously to have also some requirements to make sure that dismantling can be made in an easier manner than what is the case today. And point number, and the transition to the design element that is absolutely essential to all everything that has to come with recycling, is obviously the fact that you need to do that in a manner that is technologically and economically viable. And I think this is where we have the biggest challenge ahead of us, because when we look at the CRMs that are being recovered today, they all have a very high value, and thus obviously the companies that have invested into CRM recovery are going to make a profit out of those activities. But when it comes to CRMs that are being found indeed in very tiny quantities, which is the vast majority, and the price of those critical raw materials on the market is extremely cheap, if you want to be able to recover them in a way that makes economic sense, you obviously need to have incentives, otherwise you are going to lose money. And this is really the entire challenge, to go the extra mile. We need to make sure that we raise awareness, that we have proper actions, but that we also have a business case to be able to go and recover the CRMs. And here, there is no silver bullet. We came up as a confederation with different options, whether it's recycled content, and here we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We took, for instance, the logic that has been taken within the battery regulation that look at the life cycle of batteries as a whole, that obviously set targets for recycling, but targets also for recycled content, which are actually the most important ones, because by doing that, you are not only going to incentivize recycling, but you are going to incentivize recycling to be able to use basically the recycled materials into the same product. And obviously to do that, economies of scale, internalization of externalities. So you are going to be in a position to because you have a market that is already there, to be able to be more competitive, and that's absolutely essential. But they are not only that. We've been looking at, for instance, the use of taxation, tax breaks that has been 1 minute, okay. That can also play a role. EPR schemes, when there are EPR schemes that are being already existing, for instance, for e-waste, modulating the fees of EPR schemes based on, for instance, CRM recovery as well. So to have within EPR schemes both obviously the objectives, but also the financial incentive to go the extra mile. So we have a phone ringing with and so I think that's absolutely essential. And last but not least, we had also put forward the idea, but I think this is also more food for thought here, of strategic reserves. Since we understand that critical raw materials are obviously critical for decarbonization and for the industry of today and the future, of basically looking at how member states could build for some CRM strategic reserves and a fraction of them coming from recycling, which could be a tool of green public procurement to basically boost the demands for sustainably sourced critical raw materials. And I think here that was an idea that we put forward, but on which any reflection would be very much welcome. I know I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So we move quickly to our next speaker. So Chris, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ignacio, for the introduction. Thanks to the audience for being here still right at the end of this two-day conference. We are really at the graveyard shift, so appreciate your attention. I'm Chris. I'm here from Europe's metals industry to give the view of Europe's collective metals supply chain. Refreshing here today to talk about the circular economy aspect of critical raw materials, because often I'm involved in discussions on mining, refining, equally important, but maybe taking the spotlight in this initiative. But the recycling discussion is fundamentally important because recycling is Europe's biggest long-term opportunity to deliver a level of strategic autonomy for a lot of the raw materials that its energy transition requires. That will especially be true after 2035, 2040, once we start to see battery scrap, magnets, solar panels reach their end of life in really meaningful volumes. And basically what we're doing now is adding materials into our urban mine that will be there in 15 years' time to capitalize on if we set the right conditions and overcome the bottlenecks that Emmanuel has mentioned and which I can agree with a lot of. We hope that the Critical Raw Materials Act can be a catalyst for driving forward waste legislation in the next years, to have a targeted raw materials focus to pick up on some of their particularities like their small volumes. As was mentioned, maybe it's not going to accomplish everything itself, but it can set that direction. And also, we shouldn't be naive in this discussion because there are other regions of the world that want our scrap too. China, South Korea are implementing very aggressive industrial policies to build up their own recycling industries for various strategic raw materials and end-of-life products. And they have bigger scrap pools than us currently, so it's giving them some advantage. But they're also acting quite aggressively to access that scrap from other markets. So for Europe, it's an opportunity. But Konstantin mentioned we shouldn't be reactive as Europe. I think this is an area where we can get ahead of the curve if we take the initiative now. For the Critical Raw Materials Act itself, we understand it will be a targeted piece of legislation, and Konstantin, you confirmed that. Don't expect too many actions in the Critical Raw Materials Act. So our view is maybe that it can be the catalyst for carrying forward into what happens next. So on recycling side of things, hopefully we can confirm the approach that was taken with the batteries regulation, which was quite a good approach, and apply it to all of the waste legislation reviews that come next, whether it be the End-of-Life Vehicles Directive or the WEEE Directive for electronics waste, or the things that will come after that. Things like the improvements to collection that Emmanuel mentioned, material-specific end-of-life recycling rates, for example, all things which we could apply to other places in addition to in batteries. Maybe we can provide that catalyst. And then there are two key things I'd like to emphasize that we see could really make a difference today to help us to recover more of these materials from our products, which are standards and rules on shipments. Firstly, on standards, we think it should be at least mandatory for certain product groups like electronics waste, which is extremely complex, that recyclers of these product groups should prove that they meet standards and are able to recover these small volume materials at the efficiency rates that we should expect. There are some standards and technical specifications available for this, and we're hoping that the WEEE Directive can take it forwards. A lot of these materials are recycled through integrated processes. It happens all together, and so having one standard can help to ensure recovery of a number of materials in a symbiotic way. And secondly, shipment rules. We have a challenge today with leakage of waste from Europe, and specifically for some of these new waste streams, the intermediate waste. So our batteries get shredded and then a black mass is made, which then needs to be treated further to recover the valuable materials. That black mass, it's very easy for it to leave Europe today and be shipped to other regions. And there are regions like South Korea that are acting quite aggressively to get that black mass again for their own recycling systems. So our view is that we should be clearly defining this as a hazardous waste, the same for intermediates potentially in electronics waste recycling or others, to make sure it's the right rules for the shipments, but also helping it to keep in the European recycling loop. And then maybe to close, just a general point on consistency. Konstantin, you mentioned we have to keep consistency with what was there in the past. I guess our hope is that this Act can be a benchmark to set the direction for 2030 and also address where the consistency maybe isn't there in the legislation that we have currently. For example, the chemicals legislation is one area where it makes it very difficult to recycle some of these critical raw materials, and that's maybe something we need to look at as we move ahead. I won't detail it today, but maybe for the follow-up discussion. And I guess those would be my opening remarks, and again, hopefully a real opportunity to put targeted raw materials at the forefront of circular economy policies moving forwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So I would like just to open the floor for questions and discussions, but I would like to start with Antoine, because we have heard Konstantin explaining us a little bit about the possible coming Critical Raw Materials Act, not so much, by the way. And we have heard Chris and Emmanuel mainly focusing the recycling side of circular economy, but we understand that circular economy is more than just recycling. So I would like also to ask Antoine's opinion about what could be the role of other initiatives within circular economy as reduce, repairing. What about remanufacturing, in order to reduce this demand of critical raw materials in Europe? So before recycling, before these critical raw materials reaching the recycling side of the process, what could be the role of reuse, repairing, remanufacturing in this coming critical raw materials? How these options could be further supported in this piece of legislation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. So, yeah, my name is Antoine. I come from the Institute for European Environmental Policy, and we've been looking at the CRMs Act and other particular piece of circular economy legislation in the EU for quite some time. And yes, we've mentioned that it's just more than recycling. We've heard a lot from Emmanuel and from Chris on the different capacities and different scenarios that could be. That the Act could actually entail and support in the EU. We've also touched upon very, very briefly kind of the domestic supply operation and extraction operation that this Act could also touch upon. But again, we're not going to get into too many details on that. We mentioned about something about the question about the remanufacturing, and I will get that in a second. But I also wanted to mention some other aspect that the Act could perhaps also touch upon as part of the supply and the use of critical raw materials in the EU, and is also the external supply. Because I think you mentioned the trade policy at some point, and of course, so the supply of critical material for the EU is an absolutely crucial aspect of it. It comes from a very wide variety of countries with very different sustainable development objectives and situations. And of course, when we upscale our capacities for recycling within the EU, and when the sheer growing demand of critical materials really starts to kick in, our changing our trade routes to make sure that we do get a sustainable supply of critical materials, including from countries that actually we get along with, let's say, will have some severe consequences around the world. That's true for the population that depend on these extraction methods in their own countries. That's also true on the capacities of these countries to upscale their own circularity processes. I mean, it's something that we've talked a lot for the past years, is the circular divide. So some capacities of countries have been challenged for them to actually upscale their own operation on the matter. And the critical raw materials is no exception. So we hope that this would also be something to be touched upon, of course, in full relation with the EU trade policy in general. With regards to the remanufacturing and how it plays into the whole picture, well, to be honest, is also what Chris mentioned, our capacity actually to retake the materials that were in the circulation that now have reached not nearly their end of life. This is not an easy path. We talk about the lithium-ion batteries. It's extremely difficult to recuperate, to recycle, and to be put in a meaningful way in the manufacturing process. There are questions as to the viability of lithium once it's been used and reused a certain number of times. So that's obviously a pattern. But eventually, the whole point of this is that we would like to avoid as much as possible the extraction methods that can be socially and environmentally difficult. The circularity is a key aspect of it. And we would also like to touch upon perhaps the issue of material reduction targets somewhere in the text, because eventually this sort of targets would inherently support the capacity for us to meet the eventual demand of Critical Raw Materials Act, of critical raw materials. So that's really something that we feel could be also part of the question. Obviously, we have a lot of different CRMs. We have a lot of different sectors that are touched upon, so it's not going to be easy or even desirable in all of the sectors for this sort of material reduction targets, for instance. But eventually, this could be part of the picture. No, I don't want to take too much time, so I just wanted to introduce a bit of nuance in the whole debate. That's no one solution is free of consequences. So if we want to indeed build a Paris-compatible future, the objective of the CRMA should be primarily based on reducing our overall environmental footprint. That can happen by reducing the material use and by increasing our resource efficiency, including through remanufacturing, of course. So now I'm looking forward to seeing what's in the text. How many?
That's the conclusion.
Okay, so we open the floor. Do we have any questions here from the? Yeah, please. First.
What would be the role for...
Sorry, please introduce yourself.
Sorry, yes. Milan Petit from Systemic. And I'll be interested especially from Chris to hear what the role is for producer ownership or products as a service and how that could be used by the metals industry, but also the recycling industry to have different ways of how to do business with metals in a way that they don't need to be extracted in the first place.
I can answer that metals as a service is an area of interest for the membership, medium to longer term, and also looking at specifically where it makes sense with the certain loop that you need for the metals as a service to work. The benefit being of improving sort of ownership of the metal once it goes in, also keeping it in Europe can be an advantage there too. I guess overall, and it would be a general comment that we don't see this in the medium term replacing or reducing the need for primary material, more to keep ownership of the material and control of it through the loops. The key bottleneck in the short to medium term, although recycling is such a good medium to long term opportunity, is still to get the primary materials into the system. So I'd also mention that we don't focus too much on it today. Emmanuel.
I think, no, I completely understand the question, but I think that's more a question for OEMs, for manufacturers who are going basically who are today selling a product and tomorrow might sell a product and a service, or only a service and no product anymore. As a recycler, what we want is really to make sure that the products that are being placed on the market today are better designed for material recovery when it reaches end of life, which is absolutely essential, especially when you speak about CRMs, because of the fact that they are being used in very tiny quantities, and to have the market incentives to be able to strive. I mean, one thing I didn't touch upon too much in my intervention was tires. I mean, tires is made of rubber and many other things, but rubber being one of the main components, rubber is a CRM. So we very much depend on rubber from Malaysia, from countries in Asia for natural rubber. For synthetic rubber, it's Russia, so it's even more subject to disruption, especially nowadays. And we are lacking end markets for tire recycling in Europe today. So we think and we hope that when we are going to move towards the revision of the ELV directive, we are also going to be able to work towards better tire recycling back into new tires, so recycled content and rubber that you find also in other places of the car, for instance. So it's, yeah, I cannot answer your question because I think as a raw material producer, that is more a question targeting for manufacturers, though obviously, I mean, that will have an impact for raw materials producers as well.
Okay, thank you. We have four. Yeah.
Yes, thanks a lot. I'm Eduardo Bodo from Reuse, and I actually wanted to expand on a question that was asked previously. And I was wondering, if you think there is a role for reuse and repair in regards to critical raw materials, and how would this take place in EU policy? Thank you.
Yeah, definitely, the connection has been taken into account during discussions and during, let's say, impact assessment construction. And the legislation that is prepared soon to appear on aspects of, let's say, a more end-of-life of products on repair, reuse, will address many issues. It will probably appear or mentioned also in the documents in the package for the CRM Act, but I cannot definitely confirm. However, I want to stress, yes, it has been taken into account because it's a very important aspect. And having said that, I didn't stress on this during my intervention. What the CRM Act considers extremely important is to match practically the primary and the secondary resources in a let's say unique, homogeneous approach, and also to put together the stakeholders, because what is really damaging is to see stakeholders from more concern on the primary resources talking separately from consumers or talking separately from recyclers and secondary raw materials stakeholders. And this is something that I barely mentioned when I talked about awareness, but this is the most important issue. We have to talk, and the European Commission is prepared to push on that. We have to talk together, really together, and take all the opinions into account.
Thank you, Constantin. Andrea, do we have any question from our colleagues online? No, nothing. So yeah, we move. Thank you. And then.
Yes, hello, I'm Frédéric Simon from Euractiv.com. I'd like to have the views of the panelists about this idea of having targets for self-sufficiency, because this was an idea that was floated at some point. So I'd like to get your views about this. And also with targets for recycling, etc., and incentives for recycling. I mean, all of that goes in the direction of making raw materials in Europe more expensive probably than in other regions of the world. And so is that something that is achievable to have a sort of an island that is Europe, where everything is more expensive when other parts of the world, you know, have cheaper raw materials? Is that accepted and built into the reflection of this Critical Raw Materials Act? Thank you.
No, sorry. Yeah. On the self-sufficiency aspects, I'm, to be frank, in a wait-and-see mode, in the sense that there are so many market failures and the diversity of CRM is so wide that having an overall target of self-sufficiency obviously is going to be a challenge, I would say. On the other hand, I very much look forward to see what the text contains to be able to say more. On the more the one that is the most interesting and important to us on the recycling targets, I think when we look at the 30, 40 years of waste legislation, recycling targets per se can drive basically sustainability, but they are not a silver bullet, because basically when you recycle, you need to have an end market. And if you operate in an economy that is mostly linear, you are going to produce raw materials to a certain extent, but you need to make sure that at the end of the pipe, you have companies that are going to shift basically their feedstock and buy more materials from recycling. And this is why we strongly support, in general, pragmatic, and I insist on the word pragmatic yet ambitious, recycled content targets. I think that's really a way to basically achieve two things: economies of scales that are absolutely essential to reduce the cost. And that's for sure that when you are going to shift material sources, at the beginning you are going to have an increase of costs. But the objective by basically pulling the demand is to be able to achieve economies of scales and be competitive. And I fully agree with you, we cannot live in an island. What we produce are raw materials, and the raw materials that we produce are basically priced and traded globally. And this is why we have had also discussion with Eurometaux, not on e-waste, because on e-waste we agree that e-waste should basically be collected and processed within the EU, but the raw materials that come from recycling must not be subject to trade restrictions, because otherwise we are going basically to cut ourselves from international pricing. But so having actually strong targets in terms not only of recycling but also of use of basically materials back into products is absolutely essential to be able to do two things: circular materials and actually reduce costs. And this is also what has happened in the streams where those targets have been used.
Thank you. The metals industry, we have supported a level of objective or targets for self-sufficiency within the Critical Raw Materials Act, looking at the 2030 timeframe and setting a direction of travel that the European Commission would like to achieve for growing its domestic production where it's feasible to do so. And important to be realistic about what's achievable here, because we're limited on the mining side by what's in our resources. Looking at the pipeline of what's there, we think 20–25% of our resources, where the geology allows, could be met by Europe's mines by 2030, which isn't possible in all cases, but is for things like lithium, for copper, for nickel, and more. And a higher ambition at the processing stage, where we're not bound by geology, but we can set up refining capacity on a shorter time frame, maybe 40–50%. Again, where the market makes sense. There are some specialized markets at very low volumes, or markets where China is completely dominating, where that's not feasible. So for sure, some nuances required here. But having such a target hopefully would then allow us over the next years to look at our policies overall and see where they need to be adjusted to help us realize those goals. Our worry, I guess, would be that the Critical Raw Materials Act is delivered and then moved on from quite quickly by the next European Commission. Maybe a target can prevent that from happening. Yeah.
Thank you. So it's a pity, but we have time just for one more question. So.
Hello, Freek van Eyck of Holland Circular Hotspot, coordination group member of SSP. I have a question on the balance between going circular, diversification of input from outside Europe, and European mining. Sometimes the attention for circular economy seems to be the lesser of the goods, but let's say European mining is maybe 25%, as you just said, and it might take more than 10 years. So I have the idea that the attention for circular economy is really something at the short term we should really massively adopt, because it might also make us also less, let's say, dependent. Some reflections on this balance between the twin inputs. Who wants to reflect on that?
I think hard one to answer. When I look at the bottlenecks to the raw materials, the bottlenecks for the metals we talk about for the energy transition are in the mining stage. So the problem we have over the next 10 years is that we don't have the mine materials available or process materials available to feed the energy transition. On the recycling side, this is an easier thing to support politically. It should be supported to the maximum extent possible. But if I look to batteries, for example, we're building battery plants all over the continent, maybe more battery recycling plants than we will have battery scrap to recycle. So, and yet we haven't opened a mine for the last 15 years when it's the primary materials that's the bottleneck. So I think for sure that there can be more attention paid to circularity, and maybe it will reach more dividends, but I guess I see a situation where circular economy is the politically easy thing to talk about in this equation, and the primary side of things is the politically difficult thing to talk about and the one we need to get right, but where the progress isn't necessarily being made. So maybe I don't directly or identically answer your question or come from it from a different angle, but yeah, that's our view.
Okay, we go for one more.
We've got Antoine.
Sorry.
Sorry, just a quick second just to answer also to your question, and also talking about the target for self-sufficiency, because as we've all discussed, this is a balancing act. Yes, there's domestic extraction issues here. Yes, recyclability and circular economy in general is to be prioritized, is something that is useful. Same for the target for self-sufficiency. Is something is a very good, is an idea that is a very visible idea. I think politically it makes a lot of sense to have this somewhat as a horizon, but eventually it depends on the criteria, what kind of indicators you put in there to make it actually achievable or realistic. So that's obviously, again, a wait and see also kind of attitude. But also to mention, to come back to the balancing act, yeah, we have the extraction domestically and abroad. Yes, we have the circularity, where there's the external supply, as I've said, with definite consequences for the rest of the world if we uptake our demand. And I would like, again, to bring back into the conversation material use reduction targets, for instance. That's also part of the picture. Not for all sectors, not for all critical raw materials, but there are some that could be definitely be part of that balancing act.
Thank you. So we move to the last one because we are already out of time. So yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. Pavel here from the Institute of Circular Economy from the Czech Republic. Two quick questions. There was a mentioning of the strategic definition or the definition of critical. So what do you actually think should be included in that? Because you can view it from the demand side, which sectors will be the key for the competitiveness of the Europe, but also from the supply side, meaning where did the materials actually come from? So would like to hear more views on that. And the second thing is more about the timing. We've said that we're in the process of transition. The industry is changing, therefore the demand for materials is changing as well. So how do you think that the CRM Act should also include the time dimension? Thank you.
Yeah. No.
You're the guy who's. Yeah.
No, I just want to say about your first question. Actually, is no. Sorry. No. Your first question was the one relating to the definition. I was thinking already to answer the second. No, the definition. When I mentioned the definition, I meant we are used with the list of critical raw materials, and we saw it growing from initially 14 to 30 in 2020, and possibly even more. Now we are waiting very soon, 23, to see released the new one. These are one part of the story. They are based on a methodology that will probably have to be revised as well, looking largely at, I mentioned, supply and also economic importance. However, what is important for Europe now, if you look into the industrial policy documents, the new industrial policy document, what is important is the sectors in which Europe has excellence or has tradition or has a huge volume of activity. And we cannot give up suddenly on those. Yeah? It's not, mining in UK in the 60s, and then we needed 20 years, and still they are questioning themselves: was it good or bad? So the issue is we have to add probably to the definition of so-called strategic raw materials. Also, all those raw materials like base metals, for example, why not? Yeah, all the base metals that we are interested in, to the larger list. So, if we will call them critical raw materials or strategic raw materials or otherwise, I don't know, but this was my intention when I talked about definition. So maybe you you say yours.
I was going to say similar from our perspective, what Konstantin said on focusing the list makes a lot of sense. The critical raw materials list is very long and maybe too long, and it looks backwards at the problems of the past and maybe not the demand supply challenges of the future. And there are a number of metals not on the list which have a rising demand from the energy transition and some level of supply concern. Thinking about nickel for batteries, even copper, widely used, but really a bottleneck at the mining stage in the next decade. Aluminium, strategically relevant, but we're losing production here in Europe too. So I would say it makes a lot of sense to add these onto the list of what we're going to focus on as Europe in terms of preserving capacity and investing into new things. But that also makes it more complex maybe when we try and bring everything together, because aluminium and rare earths are even more different from each other. So support it, but it adds complexity as well as simplicity at the same time. In terms of time frame, I maybe didn't get the question exactly, but I think time frame is crucial in this debate, because this decade we have a challenge to bring primary metals in and set up our recycling systems. The next decade is when circular economy, whether it's recycling or demand reduction or everything else, will have the biggest effect. 2040, 2050, then hopefully we're well set for things afterwards. But how you bring that in, I don't know.
And to the timing issue, I want to add another thing. I mean, we are in a dynamic world. Everything is changing. So any time frame to a measure taken has to be looked in not in the current situation, not with trends, but with a full process maybe of, I would say, of foresight vision, yeah, of anticipatory vision, because what is valid now will not be valid in 5 years from now on. And so this is the power of a good policy, when you allow for the changes to be taken into account in the future. That is a story, but I would stress on the need of you, stakeholders, having the key to influence, and not. I'm not talking now about lobbying on policies. I'm talking about having very good discussions among all stakeholders in order to propose potential solutions. Yeah.
Very last word. Time is crucial for industries, and I think that we all agree here that we need to have very strong signals, that we need to go beyond simply a list. We need a consistency of legislation, so we all shoot in the same direction. You know, we are raw material producers. We have to basically abide by a number of different legislations. What we want is to have freedom of how we can do that, but we want to have the targets that are going to set a time horizon, whether it is for the recycling of for the use of recycled materials back into products. And also, you just mentioned about aluminium, and I want really here to say one thing. We as an industry, we still need to have access to international markets. That's essential. But we want to have an industry in Europe that strives. And that also means the elephant in the room, especially when you speak about CRMs, to have affordable and green energy sources for energy-intensive industries to be able to invest. And here I think that's more a comment that Chris, you could have made, but as a recycling industry, we also use a lot of energy. The energy crisis has been obviously hitting industries badly in Europe, and if we want to have more capacities to produce sustainably in Europe, we also need to make sure that this is being tackled adequately. And the more you are going to process, the more you are going to add steps to increase the volumes and the quality, the more you also will need energy. And that's maybe a point that goes beyond CRM, but that is important to mention.
Maybe I can just confirm in 10 seconds. I think that absolutely is the elephant in the room, and we can't successfully invest into metals processing capacity without affordable energy, and we don't have that.
So we're opening another.
Last 1 minute, Konstantin.
Yeah, no,
Sorry, we are totally out of time.
The elephant in the room, according to me, is when we talk about the price. Don't forget that any measure that we should think of taking politically will have an effect on money, on prices, and so on, and generally not an effect of reducing prices. Because any barrier that we put or any subsidy that we think will help in one place will bring higher prices elsewhere.
No more last minutes. Okay. Thank you very much. I think yes, my main conclusion of the session is that 1 hour is not enough. I think we could have been discussing for 1 hour more, I think.
On economic incentives, yes.
Yeah. I would like to thank Konstantin. I would like to thank Emmanuel, Chris, Antoine, Maria, Andrea. Thank you for your collaboration in the organization of this session. And just from my side, Konstantin, one of my wishes for the coming critical raw materials is market incentives. I think at the end, if we want to have circular products or recycled products in the market, and the price of these products are higher than the primary, we will never get it. So I think economic incentives is a very important issue.
We may see single market legislation coming even before the CRM Act.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you.